Let's start with a controversial statement. Armor is for cowards. A little bit extreme, but you can make a case for it considering that nobility, knights, counts, dukes, etc., kings would encase themselves in steel as much as possible, while sending common soldiers into the meat grinder with much less. Armor is for cowards. That sentiment is reflected in fantasy settings to some extent. I mean, barbarians are just like that. They look down on armor. So how do you make armor menacing and badass and all that? You can argue it is anyway, just visually, because it turns a warrior into a fighting machine. Like, you can't even see them, it dehumanizes them and all this. So it does that anyway. But how do you make it more threatening and more badass? Well, put spikes on it, right? That's the fantasy approach. Was that real? It's a very common trope in fantasy. Spikes everywhere, right? Did they do it in historical times? My gut reaction was, hell no, that's stupid. It gives the armorer more work, it adds more weight, it restricts movement, it gets in the way. You can get caught up on spikes yourself, particularly if you look at this guy. I don't care what kind of magic is involved, unless it's the magic of clipping. You're not moving properly, okay? It doesn't matter how you're propelled, even if you're just a construct, if you're a magically animated automaton, or if you're undead or whatever, it doesn't matter. You cannot move properly with this. But I wanted to give this a fair shake and take a closer look to see if there isn't some examples of that in history. Because usually, no matter what kind of generalized statement you make, there's typically some kind of exception somewhere. So here's what I was able to find. Let's start with the most extreme example right away, because I know that attention span is short. I mean, I already screwed it up by talking way too much before starting with that. But anyway, so a supposed Siberian bear hunter armor. It is completely and utterly covered in spikes. You literally cannot fit any more spikes on the entire body than this. The problem is we don't really know exactly what it's for. When you dig more deeply, you see that it's unclear exactly when it was made. 18th or 19th century is apparently as far as it can be narrowed down. And it's also unclear where it's from. It could be Russian, it could be Swiss or German or something else. There's really not a whole lot of information about this. It's not even clear whether it was really ever used, or if it was just a curiosity or an art piece or who knows what, right? And it's pretty obvious why. This is not exactly the most practical thing in the world. If you wanted to fight bears with it, I mean, how well can you move in it? Well, it might not be too bad, because apparently it's spikes on top of leather, so it does have some give. So you might be able to move in it without getting caught up too terribly much, but I can't imagine it's a comfortable thing to wear exactly. And also the mask might look cool from the outside, but looking out from the inside, you may not see all that much, because those are really small eye openings. So the field of vision would be severely limited, which may also not be great when, moving around in the woods or fighting bears or whatnot. So yeah, this is a curiosity. Whether it was practical, whether it was actually used, is doubtful, right? How about things that were used? Well, the most common thing is not actually armor. Shields and bucklers are not technically armor, they are defensive weapons. When you look for spikes, that's where you will see it the most often. And that makes sense, because you want that to be able to control the opponent's weapon and to make sure that it doesn't slide off. There are a number of ways in which they did that. Sometimes there are bars added to a buckler, and sometimes it's spikes. You see a number of depictions of that. And yes, you can punch with that too. It can be used offensively. But personally, I think it's actually more important defensively to catch the opponent's sword or other weapon on it, make sure it doesn't slip off, so you can control it, you can push it aside, you can bind it, etc. Right? That makes a lot of sense. Of course, a conventional boss does the same thing. You don't need a spike for that. But again, the spike has more offensive use as well. And yeah, it is more intimidating. That is a factor. Speaking of intimidation, I found one case that could be straight from a fantasy world. The armor of the Lord High Executioner of the state of Rewah, probably mispronounced, but I don't know how it's actually pronounced. So this is covered in spikes. Practicality is not that much of a concern. I mean, even then, it looks like the spikes on the arms are rear facing, generally. I mean, at an angle, so that they don't get in the way too much. I still would think that might be a little bit awkward to move in, but it's styled in such a way that you can at least chop straight downward. I mean, you don't need to fight in it, you just need to execute a form of height reduction surgery, so to speak. And it's not about protection, it's just about scary looks. So, not an example of functional armor, it's just something at all. Then there is a spiked helmet known as Pickelhaubed, which was usually associated with Prussia, but was also used in other areas in the 19th and early 20th century. So these are leather helmets with some metal parts, including a top spike, which was often brass. It's often said that these were meant to deflect blows coming at the head, which I honestly don't really see. You know, the way it's positioned, particularly when you look at how it's worn, the spike tends to be fairly far back and kind of angled backward. So there's not a lot of situations in which I see that protecting you at all. Considering that it's just a leather helmet, it's good to have additional metal pieces. But like a saber swing at the head, the way I see it, it's more likely to catch when it otherwise wouldn't have hit at all. In fact, I had a case of that in sparring where I was wearing a GoPro helmet, a GoPro camera on top of my helmet. And there was a cut that would have missed, but it caught on the camera or the camera mount or whatever. So I thought I was taking a hit when I wouldn't have. Otherwise, it would have just whiffed and gone over my head. And this way, you know, someone can actually control you to an extent. Because if this is strapped to your head, then your entire head is going to move if the sword or some other weapon hits that spike. So I actually think that's counterproductive. I don't know exactly what they had in mind back then, but I have to think this is more fashion than protection, really. Then there is a very different kind of spiky helmet from Kiribati in Micronesia, a group of Pacific islands. This is made of a blowfish worn as a helmet. And yeah, I don't know how protective it would have been against the weapons they were facing, you know, things like shark tooth weapons and various wooden weapons, things like that. It would probably be reasonably protective. Again, also intimidating. Definitely looks pretty cool. There are a number of different forms, depending on exactly how they cut up the fish. I'm guessing the armor made of coconut fibers was probably more protective, but this is quite a fascinating case, and it sort of counts. Okay, now we're getting to something that looks much more like what you would see in fantasy armor. In some medieval paintings, you find a single spike on an individual piece of armor, typically elbow or knee guards. I've never seen a surviving piece of armor with a spike on it as such. So with imagery like that, there's also the question, did they embellish it? There's a bit of a question mark, particularly this one here from Fiore de Liberi's manuscript. That really looks to me like it's embellishment. It's just kind of an extra doodle for fun because the spikes even look like they're added. Like the figure was drawn by itself at first, and then it looks like the spikes were added afterwards. At least that's how it seems to me. And it's a lot. It's a lot of spikes, way more than you normally see. So I have to wonder if that's just for funsies, basically. I'm not aware of any armor, again, surviving that's like this. I wouldn't be surprised if they occasionally put spikes on the knees. I don't know. That would restrict what you can do a little bit. If you want to lower yourself on one knee. They often went down to pray or whatever, so that would be a little inconvenient. On the elbows, yeah, I can see that. That would kind of work. Again, it's a case where you might get hit when the strike would have otherwise missed. I would see it the most on pauldrons, because in that case it would actually be a good thing. You know, if a strike comes in right above the shoulders toward your neck, say, then the spikes would actually catch that. And there are some blade catcher designs. But funnily enough, that's the one thing that you don't see. At least I haven't found any example. If anyone knows of something, feel free to share it in the comments. But that's exactly what I can't really find. I found something else that also looks totally fantasy. This is from the mid-19th century, made by an Italian craftsman. Unique. There's nothing else I'm aware of that looks anything like this. What's referred to as a clawed arm defense. And yeah, this thing is wild. You can see yourself. Interesting that there's nothing else really, because this could very well be practical. You know, particularly in a judicial duel, you know, both could wear one of these. In other scenarios, I mean, it's not something that you would run around with in everyday life for self-defense. And on the battlefield, you'd be better off with a shield. But I could at least see this being practical. You know, it protects your forearm. It can, again, catch enemy weapons. You can bind them. You can kind of hook and control, things like that. You can even sort of punch with a forward-facing spike. So this would actually be reasonably practical, but again, not common at all in history. So finally, this is what I consider the most practical example. Still not exactly common by any means. Oh, but first, for fun, how about this? This is a cartoon of an armored lady from a Russian almanac. So again, didn't exist quite like that, but it's fun to see. Okay, so spiked gauntlets. These are pairs that were made for the Emperor Maximilian I. This pair, for example, is from 1485. Spiked knuckles. I can see that. It's perfectly functional gauntlets. Nothing wrong with that. Whether this was really made with practical function in mind or just to be extra fancy for the Emperor, you know, I mean, they even have stylized fingernails, which is not functional either. And also, these are made of brass, so not exactly great for punching someone in the helmet or whatever, right? These other ones look like they're made of steel, heavily ornamented. So they might have been for, again, ceremonies or tournaments maybe, or whatever, but would still be practical. I can see that. You know, there's a point to be made here. So yeah, if you want to run around with spiked knuckles, sure. It doesn't really detract from the function of the gauntlets. Personally, I would prefer them on mitten gauntlets because they're much more protective. Either way, it can also be done. There's also a fragment, a single spiked knuckle guard plate that was found. Interestingly, this is made of copper alloy from 1350 to 1400. So again, not amazing. You know, copper is not the greatest material for that. Although the spike itself is quite solid and not overly pointed, so you could probably still use that. But yeah, overall, when it comes to actually functional spiked armor that looks anything like fantasy armor, there's hardly anything, really. and very few confirmed cases because, well, it's kind of stupid. Let's face it. There's not really a whole lot of reason. You don't get much benefit. Again, you limit your range of motion. You might get caught up on it. You might, enemy weapons might hit you when they would have otherwise missed. Things like that. It adds weight. It's more complicated to make for very little benefit. Like, yes, sure, elbowing or kneeing someone with a spike would be more effective than without, but is it worth it? Not really. I wouldn't say so. But at least there are a few examples that are related, at least. Overall, unless you look like one of these guys, you probably don't want the spikes. Anyway, I hope you found this interesting. Thanks for watching. Check out my Patreon page as well if you want to support the channel. It's much appreciated. Definitely makes a big difference. And I'll let you go now. Take care.